I, 38F, have discovered my boyfriend, 42M, of 8 months, is trying to use me financially, and I'm not sure how to confront him without causing drama for our kids. Longtime lurker, first-time poster. I am at a complete loss regarding my boyfriend and his increasingly manipulative behavior around money. Sorry in advance for the length, but I need to include all the details, and typing this out is honestly therapeutic. Some background. I'm a single mom of 2 kids, 15 Miam and 12 Fef, running my own business in a small rural town. After my divorce 5 years ago, my ex left me with nearly $50,000 in hidden credit cards and loans, but I worked hard to build financial stability. I started a local service business that eventually grew enough to support us comfortably. It wasn't easy, especially in a place where you need a car to get anywhere, but I made it work. I promised my kids we wouldn't move again until after high school, since the divorce had already affected them enough. About 8 months ago, I started dating Greg, 42 Mems, who's also a single parent with a 14-year-old daughter, Alina. She primarily lives with her mom but visits on weekends. Greg works as a contractor, but between jobs seems to be his permanent status. Not judging, but it's relevant. He's always mentioning money problems despite having minimal expenses. He rents a small apartment, shares custody, so has his daughter only part-time, and has no debt that I know of. I sympathized with his situation at first. When we first met at a community fundraiser, Greg was charming and attentive. He asked thoughtful questions about my business and seemed genuinely impressed by what I'd built, which, I'll admit, felt nice after years of my ex dismissing my work. For the first few months, everything seemed perfect. He'd bring small gifts, nothing expensive, just thoughtful, helped around the house occasionally, and my kids seemed to like him well enough. Looking back now, I can see some issues I missed. Around month 3, Greg started forgetting his wallet when we'd go out to eat. The first couple times, I laughed it off and covered the bill. Then there were small emergencies. His car needed a repair, his rent was due before a client paid him, etc. I lent him maybe $2,000 total over several months in these small increments. He always promised to pay me back next week, but somehow that never materialized. I didn't push it because it wasn't breaking my bank, and I genuinely wanted to help. Everything came to a head last weekend. We were having dinner at my place, me, my kids, Greg, and Alina, when the topic of summer plans came up. Out of nowhere, Greg casually mentions, since we've been together for 8 months now, we should think about taking a family vacation. Maybe that resort you were talking about? I reminded him that the resort was pretty expensive, and Greg just smiled and said, "Well, you've got that business of yours, and I know you've been saving." There was an awkward silence. My son exchanged glances with his sister, and I noticed his jaw tightening. I quickly changed the subject. Later, after the kids went upstairs, Greg brought up our future and suggested moving in together to save money. He outlined a plan to sell my house to buy a bigger one using my equity. He cited reasons related to his daughter and the benefits of a more spacious home. When I asked about my own kids' spaces and needs, he responded dismissively, saying my kids are self-sufficient and that I've given them everything while his daughter has gone without. Suddenly, I saw the pattern that had been developing for months. Greg consistently expected me to pay when we went out, which I initially didn't mind, but it became the norm. He's borrowed money several times with vague promises to repay, but he hasn't. He regularly comments on how lucky I am financially, despite my situation being the result of years of hard work. After his comment, I asked him to leave earlier than planned, making up an excuse about having an early client meeting the next day. He seemed annoyed, but didn't push it. I spent the entire night reviewing our relationship and noticed how he had slowly pushed for more financial involvement while contributing virtually nothing himself. I realized he had never once paid for groceries when cooking at my house. He suggested shopping trips, but I always ended up paying. He talked about activities for the kids, but I was always the one purchasing tickets or supplies. Once, when I suggested he cover an inexpensive dinner, he made a joke about women wanting equality until the check comes. When I called my sister the next morning, she pointed out that Greg's behavior reminded her of my ex's financial control tactics, just with a different approach. My ex was more direct, demanding control of our accounts and questioning every purchase, while Greg uses a "we're a team" approach while contributing nothing and expecting everything. What's making me really concerned is realizing how deeply Greg has thought about accessing my assets. He's mentioned my retirement savings a few times, asking questions about my investment strategy. He's commented on my business's potential for expansion. He's even suggested I help Alina with future college costs since I'm good with money, despite never mentioning any contribution to my own kids' education funds. The more I reflect, the more instances come to mind. Last month, his car broke down again, and instead of asking to borrow money for repairs, he started researching new cars and sending me links discussing our next vehicle purchase. When I mentioned I wasn't planning to replace my car anytime soon, he said he was not replacing mine, but getting something reliable for himself, especially since he's driving Alina around in his old car, as if I should be financing his new car. Even Alina has made comments that suggest Greg has been setting expectations about my financial role. She once asked if I could take her shopping for a new phone because Greg said I'm really generous and like helping people out. Another time, she mentioned being excited about having her own bathroom in our new house. These comments didn't fully register at the time, but now they're clear signs that Greg has been setting expectations with his daughter about accessing my resources. I've decided I need to confront Greg about my concerns, but I'm conflicted about how to approach it. I don't want a huge blow-up, especially since our kids have developed a relationship. My son seems to have already noticed the dynamics, which makes me feel like a failure as a parent. I promised myself they'd never see another man take advantage of me after their father. This morning, my son asked me if everything was okay financially. Apparently, he overheard Greg telling me about another temporary cash flow problem last week. The fact that my child is worried about our stability because of Greg's behavior makes me angry. My kids went through enough financial stress during the divorce. What's making this even more complicated is that while I can see the financial manipulation now, Greg has been kind in other ways. He remembers important dates, he's good with my younger child, and he seemed supportive of my business until now. I can't help wondering if I'm overreacting or if there's a way to salvage this relationship by establishing better boundaries. The more I think about it, the more I realize this probably isn't something we can work through. Someone who respected me wouldn't be making these kinds of assumptions about my finances or presenting plans that benefit his child while dismissing mine. I've spent 5 years rebuilding our stability, and I'm not about to let someone else jeopardize that again. Am I wrong for feeling used and manipulated about this? Please be honest. I can take it. I need perspective from people who aren't emotionally invested in this situation like I am. Now for the first update. First, I want to thank everyone who commented on my post about Greg's financial manipulation. Your support and advice helped me see the situation clearly when I was second-guessing myself. It's been about 2 weeks since my original post. After writing everything out and reading your responses, I decided to spend a week really paying attention to Greg's behavior instead of confronting him immediately. I started keeping track of all the little comments and requests in my Notes app, something many of you suggested. Thank you for that. It was clear to see it all written down in black and white. During that week, I also talked with my kids. I didn't want to badmouth Greg, but I needed to know if they'd noticed anything concerning. Turns out they both had. My son admitted he felt uncomfortable whenever Greg talked about money, and my daughter said she noticed he never offered to pay for anything when we went out together. My son then heard Greg on the phone telling someone he was finally with someone who could give Alina the life she deserves. To clarify, since many are asking, no, I never promised Greg financial support or discussed paying for anything related to Alina's future. He just assumed my resources would become our resources, while his debts would remain his problem. I decided to meet Greg at a restaurant rather than at my home for the confrontation. Several of you warned me about having this conversation in private, and I'm so grateful for that advice now. I picked a place that wasn't too crowded but had enough people around. When I arrived, Greg was already there. I waited until after we ordered to bring up my concerns. I tried to be calm and specific, pointing out the pattern I'd noticed of one-sided financial expectations. You should have seen how quickly his expression changed. His smile tightened, and he immediately went on the defensive, saying I was keeping score and that real relationships don't count dollars and cents. When I mentioned the $2,000 in emergency loans he'd never repaid, He said he thought those were gifts because I cared about him. I explained that I wasn't comfortable moving forward in a relationship with such a financial imbalance, especially given my responsibilities to my kids. He accused me of being just like other successful women who look down on men who aren't wealthy. People at nearby tables were starting to stare, mortifying but also validating in a weird way. When I pointed out that he seemed to want to be a financial dependent rather than a partner, he called me a cold-hearted bitch and said my children were spoiled brats who need discipline, not more stuff. I'm still in shock typing those words. My kids, who he barely interacts with, who have never asked him for a single thing. I ended things immediately. I just paid for my meal, yes, only mine, and walked out while he continued yelling about how Alina would be heartbroken and how I had led them on. Several diners were openly staring at this point. Once I got to my car, I called my sister. She suggested changing the lock since Greg had a key to my house, something I hadn't even thought about. Thank God for level-headed sisters. By the time I got home, my phone was full of texts from Greg, first apologizing, then accusing me of leading him on, then guilt-tripping me about Alina and how she had counted on our future together. I couldn't believe how quickly he cycled through tactics, though many of you predicted exactly this response in your comments. That evening, I got a call from Vanessa, a mutual friend who'd heard about our restaurant scene from another patron. Small town problems. Ugh. She wanted to check if I was okay, and then revealed something interesting. Apparently, many people in our social circle had noticed Greg's weird behavior around money and success. He would insert himself into conversations about investments or business opportunities despite his own track record of financial instability. I felt validated but also embarrassed that I hadn't seen what others had. I blocked Greg's number and social media accounts that night, after saving screenshots of his messages, as many of you advised. I also changed my locks first thing the next morning and had a talk with my kids about reporting any contact from Greg immediately. My son seemed relieved, but he's still being extra vigilant about Greg's car in our neighborhood. Breaks my heart that my 15-year-old feels he needs to protect us. The next day, I received an email from Alina. She's 14, remember. It was clearly written at Greg's direction, talking about how confused and hurt she was that I abandoned them, and how she had been excited about our family plans. I didn't respond, though it broke my heart a little. I know she's just a kid caught in her father's manipulation, but engaging would only make things worse. Edit. Some people have asked why I didn't see these red flags sooner. Looking back, I realize I was so focused on proving I could provide stability for my kids after my divorce that I ignored warning signs. Greg was careful to escalate slowly, first forgetting his wallet occasionally, then the small emergency loans, and only recently the bigger suggestions about vacations and moving in together. It's been almost 2 weeks now, and I'm starting to feel like myself again. My business is doing well. My kids seem more relaxed now that Greg isn't around, and I've even started reconnecting with friends I'd been seeing less of since dating him. Another red flag I missed. He always had reasons why we couldn't meet up with my friends. I haven't heard from Greg in a few days, which makes me nervous in a way. Several of you warned about manipulative people when they realize their tactics aren't working. I've documented everything just in case, but I'm hoping he's moved on to his next target, though I wouldn't wish him on anyone. Thank you all again for your support and validation. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that I wasn't crazy or overreacting. Not sure what to expect going forward, but I'll update if anything significant happens with Greg or if I learn anything else about the financial manipulation he was planning. Now for the second update. Well, it's been about 3 weeks since my last post about Greg, which somehow got locked. Sorry about that. And things have gone from bad to worse in ways I never expected. I want to thank everyone who reached out with support and advice. Your comments have been a lifeline during this nightmare. So remember how I mentioned I hadn't heard from Greg in a few days and it was making me nervous? My instincts were right. Last week, I got a call from the state tax office saying my business was being audited due to an anonymous tip about potential irregularities. The timing is way too suspicious to be coincidental, and my accountant agrees. She's furious. At first, I tried to convince myself Greg wouldn't go that far, but then my son came home from school looking upset. Turns out Alina has been posting all these vague but obvious comments on social media about how I used and abandoned her dad. She even wrote something about fake women who pretend to care that got shared around their school. My kids go to a small rural school where everyone knows everyone's business, so this has been really hard on them. Then I started hearing through the grapevine that Greg has been telling people I'm the one with financial problems. According to mutual friends, he's spreading this story that I broke up with him because he refused to loan me money. The absolute audacity of this man to completely flip the script. Several people have asked me about it, which is mortifying. I've worked so hard to build my reputation in this community. My son admitted he's been worried about me after overhearing one of Greg's friends at the local hardware store saying I was using Greg for contractor work and then dumping him. My poor kid has been trying to protect me from hearing these rumors. He's 15, but sometimes acts like he's the parent, both sweet and heartbreaking. But the situation went from uncomfortable to genuinely concerning when I discovered Greg applied for a contracting job at the office complex where my business is located. The building manager called to give me a heads up, which was decent of him, but said there wasn't much he could do to prevent the hiring since Greg is technically qualified. The idea of having to potentially run into him every day, I've already started checking hallways before leaving my office. Then yesterday, everything came to a head while grocery shopping with my daughter. We were in the produce section when I heard someone loudly say, "Oh look, it's the woman who thinks she's too good for us." Greg was standing there with Alina, deliberately blocking the aisle with his cart and staring me down. I tried to just navigate around them politely. Public scene was the last thing I wanted. But then Alina stepped forward and said, "Why did you promise to be family and then leave us?" I was completely blindsided because I had never made any such promises to this poor girl. As other shoppers started watching, small town, remember, this will be gossip by dinner, my daughter tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Mom, he told her to say that. I heard him outside." Using his own daughter as a manipulation tool? New low, even for Greg. While I was trying to process this, Greg started loudly consoling Alina. Some people only care about money, honey, not building a real family. He was making sure everyone in the produce section heard. I quietly told Greg this wasn't the place for this discussion, especially with our kids present. That's when he stepped closer, too close, and whispered, "You'll regret embarrassing me like this. This town isn't big enough for secrets." I can still hear it when I try to sleep. Then something unexpected happened. My daughter suddenly spoke up. "My mom works really hard for us. You just wanted her money." The look on Alina's face shifted from sadness to confusion. Greg immediately grabbed Alina's arm to pull her away. Thank goodness the store manager approached at that point. Apparently, other customers had already complained about Greg's behavior. Not surprising, given how loud he was being. The manager asked Greg to leave the premises, which he did, but not before turning back to loudly announce, "You're all going to learn what she's really like. Trust me," while pointing at me. After they left, the manager mentioned that Greg had been telling people around town that I owed him money and had cheated him in business. Completely fabricated claims. I was so shaken, I could barely finish shopping. Thank goodness for self-checkout, because I was fighting back tears the whole time. My kids were visibly upset on the drive home. My son suggested we start documenting everything, just in case. I agreed it was a good idea, though I tried to reassure them that everything would be fine. Not sure they believed me. Not sure I believed myself. Just when I thought the day couldn't get worse, I checked my email last night and found a message from the building manager of my office complex. Greg had indeed been hired for the maintenance position, which starts next week. This job gives him access to pretty much every part of the building, including my business space. I barely slept. I'm trying to figure out my next steps. The building manager seems sympathetic, but says his hands are tied without some kind of legal restraining order, which feels like a huge escalation. I've started documenting every interaction and saving screenshots of the rumors I've heard he's spreading, thanks to those who suggested keeping records in my last post. I'll try to respond to comments, but honestly, I'm meeting with a lawyer tomorrow to understand my options, and that's taking most of my mental energy. Part of me just wants to sell my business and move to a new town where nobody knows us, but I promised my kids stability after the divorce, and I refuse to let Greg force us out of the community we've built here. I know I need to see this through, for my kids' sake, as much as my own. Now for the final update. Final update on the Greg situation. First off, thank you all so much for your advice and support, especially those who told me to document everything. You literally saved me. It's been about a month since my last post. After that grocery store incident and finding out Greg got hired at my building, I immediately contacted a lawyer. Best money I've ever spent, honestly. She helped me file for a restraining order based on all the evidence I'd been collecting. Thank God I listened to you all about keeping records. While waiting for the court date, things got even worse. Greg apparently decided to destroy my reputation in business. He started, coincidentally, appearing whenever clients would approach my office, making comments just loud enough for them to hear, like, "Be careful with her invoices," or "Make sure you check her work carefully." He also started driving by my house at random times, sometimes slowing down to pass by, other times honking and speeding away. My security cameras caught this at least 14 times in 3 weeks. The building manager kept giving me excuses about Greg working there, saying, potential wrongful termination if they fired him without cause. I felt trapped in my own business space, checking hallways before leaving my office and timing my bathroom breaks for when I knew he'd be working on another floor. Then Vanessa, who'd been trying to stay neutral this whole time, called me after a local business networking event. Apparently, Greg had been telling everyone that I had stolen business ideas from him and was now trying to ruin his relationship with his daughter. She said she couldn't stay silent anymore after hearing him twist everything. She agreed to provide a written statement about what she'd witnessed. Honestly, didn't expect that. Sometimes people surprise you. The day of the restraining order hearing finally arrived. I drove an hour to the county courthouse. My sister took time off work to be there with me. Still owe her big time for that. I arrived early, clutching my binder of evidence. Screenshots of texts, emails, witness statements, security camera footage, everything. When my case was called, I walked up. The judge went through my documentation and asked me several questions about the timeline and Greg's escalating behavior, making notes the whole time. Then it was Greg's turn. He walked in. He immediately started talking about how he just wanted to provide stability for his daughter and how I had promised to help them financially. He said I'd led him on with promises of a future together, then abandoned them when he needed me most. The judge let him talk for about 5 minutes before interrupting him. "Sir," she said while holding up printed copies of his text messages, "can you explain these threats to expose Miss, my last name, if she didn't reconsider your relationship?" Greg's demeanor changed. His voice got louder as he insisted I had manipulated everyone and that all the witnesses were her friends. The judge looked over her glasses at him and asked specifically about the text where he wrote, "You'll regret this when I tell everyone who you really are," and another where he said, "Better reconsider if you want to keep your reputation in this town." He tried claiming everything was taken out of context and he was just expressing his feelings. The judge wasn't having it. She pointed to Vanessa's statement, someone he had specifically called his friend, and asked why someone he trusted would say these things if they weren't true. He started stammering about how I must have manipulated her too. When the judge mentioned the grocery store incident and how multiple witnesses had reported his behavior, including the store manager, Greg tried interrupting her. She held up her hand and said, "Mr. his last name, I've heard enough." The restraining order was granted on the spot. The judge specifically mentioned that Greg was prohibited from entering my business premises, which effectively meant he'd lose his new maintenance job. She also ordered him to stay at least 100 yards away from me, my home, and my children at all times, with no contact whatsoever. As we left the courthouse, my sister was walking ahead to get the car when Greg shouted across the parking lot, "This isn't over. You'll never be able to show your face in town again." The judge's clerk was walking out right behind us and witnessed the whole thing. She immediately went back inside, presumably to report it, and Greg realized his mistake because he ran to his truck. The next day, I received an email from the building management company apologizing for their handling of the situation. Apparently, the courthouse had already notified them about the restraining order, and they assured me that Greg's replacement would be properly vetted. They also mentioned something about reviewing their hiring policies. Not everything resolved, though. Some people in town who've known Greg longer still believe his side of the story. Small towns, right? But many others who witnessed his behavior firsthand have been supportive. Several business owners nearby have offered to walk me to my car after hours, and my neighbor, a retired police officer, checks in regularly. The most surprising development came last week when my daughter showed me a message from Alina. Greg's daughter actually reached out to apologize, saying her dad had told her I promised to pay for her college and buy her a car if he moved in with me. She said she felt used when she realized he'd been coaching her on what to say to make me feel guilty. Life is returning to normal, though I still feel anxious when I see a truck that looks like Greg's. My business is recovering from the temporary impact on my reputation, and my kids seem less on edge now that we're not constantly monitoring our environment. Edit. To clarify, since some comments asked about the legal side, the restraining order is for 6 months initially, but can be extended if needed. My lawyer said Greg's courthouse outburst significantly strengthened my case for any future extensions, as it showed his true colors. Also, the building management didn't technically fire him. They just informed him he couldn't legally enter the premises where I work, making it impossible for him to do his job. This apparently helped them avoid the wrongful termination issue they were worried about. I never imagined a relationship that started so normally would turn into this difficult situation. But I've definitely learned some valuable lessons about watching for red flags. Thank you all again for your support and advice throughout this ordeal. This community helped me when I needed it most.